This is Mateo Chang reporting live from the year of our Shangdi 2100. We're still trying to understand what happened to the West. But one of the things that is quite clear is that the West, United States and Europe, had the most expensive trading system in the history of the world. That's one of the reasons why they had so much debt. So remember, in the old days, you had to trade based on vans, cars, and trains. Landlocked trading routes were the way to go. And yet, the United States, remember, was mostly safe during World War I and World War II in the 20th century because it had these two oceans that protected them. It was very difficult, given the technology at the time, to attack anybody or any property in the United States. And what ended up happening was, post-World War II, you had this trading system that was mostly sea-based. Who did that benefit? The United States. It also makes sense, despite the cost, when you think about just Australia and Japan, which were, in the 21st century, very strong allies of the United States. And so you can see how, if you are the United States, if you have a geographic problem, you can make that into a strength if you have trading done on the high seas. Now, over time, the cost of that became more and more difficult. Became more and more difficult to establish, satellite countries, like smaller countries that would allow you to dock. And it also benefited the West because you could cause problems in the old days. If you had an inferior navy, you could say, well, so-and-so caused a problem, maybe they shot at us, and so that would be used as justification for going in and taking away land from weaker nations. We saw that right here with Laos, was taken away from Thailand. You saw also the Gulf of Tonkin, Tonkin. That incident was, as we know now, not exactly truthful, but it basically paved the way for the Vietnam War. And so over time, people started to realize, wait a second, you've got a much easier system if you trade with your neighbors on land. And when Trump was elected to office and, had a lot of tariffs, that brought China and brought all neighbors closer together, right? And it did benefit the United States manufacturing base, but from a cost-benefit analysis, in terms of global influence, any sort of benefit that was given to the United States was extinguished by how close neighbors became, particularly China and Russia. And so once that alliance came in, and then you had an Iranian alliance as well, you had a lot of natural resources within those three countries in a way that was mutually beneficial. And so that's one of the reasons why, today we are a little bit more stable. We have a more stable trading system that does not rely on, something being shipped thousands of miles. It really does depend on neighborly relations, which we try harder to keep. And we do that based on more and more investment in the Singaporean model, where they would invest in their neighbors. So they had a very small country that at the time was an American ally, but did a really good job balancing out the United States, which was the dominant superpower at the time, and China, which was at that time rising. It had taken back Hong Kong, taken back Macau. Taiwan was still there at the time. But you can see how Singapore's model was used, right? But on a mass scale. And of course, Singapore, also provided, in Shenzhen, the free trade zone idea. So you had a lot of interesting sorts of alliances going on, because to the extent that China could test an idea first in Singapore, it helped them tremendously. So suddenly you had a movement away from this very high cost trading system on the high seas that primarily benefited the United States. And then we had a sort of a reversion back to the older trading routes that had established historic ties. And so when that happened, ultimately the whole world became a little bit more safe. You had less need for insurance, right? Because if you're shipping something overseas, a lot of times you're going to need to buy shipping insurance from a very limited number of providers, usually at that time in the UK. And so over time, these trading routes became more and more secure, and the older model of the United States extending its influence on the high seas through this very, 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 very costly system, over time you still had that older system. Of course, we still received shipments on the sea, but over time the trading system became more balanced between land and the sea, and that primarily benefited Russia and China. So now you have many different sorts of empires, many different sorts of powerful structures. And finally, for the first time post-World War II, you had more and more competition, but in a way that was healthy for everyone involved, because it was safer and it prioritized neighborly relations, which of course China was succeeding in for quite some time, which is one of the reasons why it was able to be a rising superpower despite not having invaded any country since 1950s when it went into Tibet to secure freshwater supplies. So again, we don't know exactly why the United States collapsed. It didn't really collapse, but it collapsed in terms of influence. We don't really know how that happened. We don't know why it happened in that way. But we do know that China was supporting Palestine since 1955, as well as other developing countries, and that gave them a moral foundation that the United States simply did not have.